The principal forces a poor student to play the cello to mock him. And she ends up regretting her actions. The invisible cellist of Riverside Academy, he arrived at school with a damaged violin, old sneakers, and total silence. They didn't put him on stage for his talent. They put him on stage to humiliate him. But when he struck the strings with his bow, the entire auditorium froze. Teachers, classmates, even the principal, no one expected to hear that. Subscribe to the channel and tell me where you are watching from. The cracked pane of the window frame peeled under the summer heat while a single ray of sunlight slipped into the narrow kitchen of a third-floor apartment in a South Bronx housing project. It landed on the worn linoleum and traced its path to the boy sitting at the table, back straight, his dark fingers neatly crossed over his knees. His name was Joseph Thompson, 13 years old, with eyes too solemn for his age. His slender frame was dressed in a faded blue t-shirt and frayed jeans. The soles of his sneakers curled at the edges. Opposite him, his grandmother stirred a pot of grits on the stove. The aroma of butter and salt filled the cramped space, but neither of them spoke. She moved slowly, with the measured care of someone who knew how to stretch every ounce of strength. A headscarf covered her graying hair, and the wrinkles on her face bore silent witness to years of difficult choices and quiet endurance. On the table next to Joseph lay a dented cello case, worn and soft at the edges like a well-used Bible. The latch had broken long ago, replaced by a shoelace tied in a double knot. Joseph had been up since before dawn as always. Summer mornings were the only time he could practice without interruption. His building was filled with noise-crying babies, barking dogs, and the occasional police siren wailing through the streets. But none of that interrupted his concentration. Sometimes he played in the hallway near the radiator, where the acoustics were perfect. Other times, he played on the roof, the city spreading out beneath him like a living, groaning thing. The cello hadn't always been his. His mother, a music teacher before her illness, had rescued it from a burned-out art school downtown. It was already damaged back then, its back cracked, strings missing. But she had repaired it, painted the wood with careful hands, and placed it on Joseph's lap when he was 8 years old. "It will speak for you," she had said, the tremor in her voice barely perceptible at the time. "When the world will not listen to your words." That cello had outlived her. He had continued to play even after she was gone, especially after. When his grandmother cried at night behind the bedroom door, he played soft lullabies. When his classmates mocked him at school, he played until his fingers ached. He didn't read music like the others. Everything he played, he learned by ear or felt in his bones. That morning, a letter had arrived. It was folded and wrinkled with an embossed school seal at the top. Riverside Academy, it read, printed in an elegant serif font with too much space between the lines, as if the words themselves despised anyone who read them. Joseph's name was right underneath, accepted with a full scholarship. His grandmother had cried, not soft, dignified tears, but the kind of sobs that came from deep within the chest. She hugged him, kissed his forehead, and said, "Your mama would have been so proud." But Joseph didn't feel proud. He felt nervous. Riverside Academy wasn't the kind of place for boys like him. He knew it even before seeing it. He had heard whispers from other neighborhood kids about Golden Gates, classrooms with underfloor heating, and students who wore tailored uniforms and carried tablets. Instead of books. It was a place where power dressed in old fortunes and polished shoes, where children came with last names that opened doors and fathers with law firms. Yet, he went. On the first day of school, Joseph woke up before the sun. He put on the uniform the scholarship office had sent him. It was one size too large, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. He slicked his hair back, packed his lunch in a brown paper bag, and carried his cello case with both hands. His grandmother kissed his forehead again and whispered a prayer in his ear. Then he boarded the bus alone. The ride to Riverside felt like crossing into another world. The city faded, replaced by wide streets, manicured lawns, and houses with gates higher than people. When the bus finally stopped in front of the school, Joseph looked out the window, unable to move. The building was enormous, built of old stone, the windows glinting like watchful eyes. Marble pillars lined the main entrance. Students poured out of sleek cars and town cars, their shoes shiny, their hair perfect. He stepped off the bus, and the weight of every gaze on campus seemed to fall directly onto his shoulders. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with disdain, and many didn't bother to hide either. Inside, the hallways were quieter than he expected. The floors were so clean they reflected the ceiling lights. Paintings of former headmasters lined the walls, all white, all frowning. Joseph walked slowly, his cello case bumping lightly against his knee with every step. He stopped in front of a glass case containing trophies and photos of past graduating classes. No one in those photos looked like him. He found his classroom and entered just as the bell rang. A silence fell over the room. The students turned to look at him, some raising eyebrows, others snickering under their breath. A girl in the front row whispered something to her neighbor who stifled a laugh. Joseph kept his head down and took the only empty seat at the back. Name? The teacher asked without looking up from her attendance sheet. Joseph Thompson, he said. She paused, noted something on the paper and continued. She did not smile. The day passed in a blur of classes, presentations, and staircases. At lunch, he ate alone at the end of a courtyard bench, unwrapping his peanut butter sandwich while groups around him discussed ski trips and private tutors. He heard his name whispered once, twice, then a third time, followed by laughter. In his last period of the day, music theory, he met Mr. Shelby, tall, gray-haired, and impeccably dressed in a fitted vest. Mr. Shelby stood at the front of the class like a man delivering an oath. He spoke of Bach and Tchaikovsky, of form and function, of the elegance of structure. His voice was clear and authoritative, his words steeped in condescension. At the end of class, Mr. Shelby asked if anyone in the room had prior musical experience. A few hands went up: violin, piano, flute. Joseph hesitated but raised his hand too. Shelby's gaze landed on him with slight surprise. Yes, Mr. Thompson. I play the cello, Joseph said softly. The teacher smiled, not kindly, but with a spark of malice. Wonderful, he said. Then we shall hear from you at the assembly next week. You will open our autumn showcase. The room erupted in whispers. But I haven't started. Shelby made a dismissive gesture with his hand. No need to be modest. I'm sure the school will appreciate your unique perspective. Joseph sat back, stunned. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't even agreed. And yet, there it was. Decided, confirmed, final. The bell rang, and students rushed out, some laughing, others shaking their heads. A boy, tall and broad-shouldered, brushed past Joseph and muttered, "This is gonna be good." That night, Joseph barely touched his dinner. His grandmother noticed, but she didn't press him. He sat by the window after washing the dishes, his cello on his lap. He didn't play. He simply looked at it, his fingers resting on the strings. He was no longer sure the world would ever listen to what he had to say. But somewhere deep in his chest, just beneath the ache of doubt, something flickered. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the first breath of defiance. The next morning, the city seemed grayer than usual. The rain hadn't come yet, but the air was thick with its promise. Joseph went through the motions of breakfast in silence, barely registering the soft gospel humming on the radio or the clink of his grandmother's spoon against the rim of her teacup. The memory of Mr. Shelby's announcement haunted him like a shadow, too stubborn to leave even in the sunlight. He had tried for a brief second to convince himself it wasn't real, that the invitation to the showcase had been a misunderstanding or a passing comment, made to entertain the room. But as soon as he entered the music wing, the looks he received from other students confirmed what he already knew. The trap had been set, and he had walked right into it. The showcase was a long-standing tradition at Riverside Academy. An official assembly held every autumn in the great auditorium where students presented their musical, theatrical, or artistic talents before an audience of faculty, parents, alumni, and donors. For most students, it was a chance to impress the kind of people who could change lives with a signature or a phone call. For Joseph, it was a stage he had never asked to step onto, with spotlights aimed not to honor, but to expose. That day during music class, Mr. Shelby pulled him aside after the bell rang. The other students filed out, some casting looks over their shoulders, smiling with anticipation. The room smelled of varnished wood and brass polish. The shelves were lined with pristine instruments, each in perfect condition and likely worth more than Joseph's entire apartment. "I've reserved a school cello for you," Mr. Shelby said without preamble, walking across the room to another storage cabinet. "You'll use it for the showcase." He pulled out a sleek black hard case and laid it carefully on a table. Joseph approached, hesitating. When the case was opened, his breath caught for a moment. It was a beautiful instrument. The wood glowed under the lights, the strings perfectly aligned, but when he reached out and plucked one, the pitch was wrong, distorted. Another string felt loose. He ran his fingers gently over the body and saw it. A long, thin crack running down the back, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew how to look. Joseph glanced at Mr. Shelby, whose expression remained inscrutable. "It's seen a bit of use," the teacher said almost too nonchalantly, "but I'm sure you'll manage." He wanted to ask for another instrument, but he could already hear the implicit consequences. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a test wrapped in an insult. He nodded softly, took the cello, and walked out of the room as Mr. Shelby's voice floated behind him. "I look forward to hearing you rehearse tomorrow." That evening, Joseph sat at the kitchen table, the broken school cello resting beside him, staring at it as if it were a loaded weapon. His own cello, old and splintered but familiar, leaned against the wall in the corner. His grandmother noticed the expression on his face and stopped chopping onions. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. Joseph hesitated. He didn't want to worry her. "It's not mine," he finally said. "It doesn't sound right." "You play it like you play yours, and it will," she said, though she clearly didn't understand the weight of what he was carrying. He nodded anyway, and went to his room, closing the door behind him. That night, he didn't touch the school cello. Instead, he took his own out of its soft cloth cradle, sat on the floor, and began to play. The notes came slowly at first, harsh and uncertain, but as he settled into the music, they became bolder. He didn't play Bach or Brahms, or any of the pieces Mr. Shelby would expect. He played something of his own, of melody that had no name, built from memory and silence and the faint heartbeat of longing that lived in his chest. It was a lament and a protest all at once. And when he finished, the room seemed both emptier and fuller than before. The following days unfolded like a silent countdown. News of his performance had spread beyond the music department. In the cafeteria, whispers followed him. "He's going to crash and burn," someone said too loudly. Another student pretended to play an invisible cello and fake cried. Even the teachers began to treat him differently, some with forced politeness, others with barely veiled skepticism. He wasn't assigned any official rehearsal space. The music rooms were suddenly booked or under maintenance every time he tried to sign up. Lacking other options, he began to practice in an old maintenance room near the gym, the only place that didn't smell of bleach or mildew. The acoustics were terrible, but it was quiet. He practiced in the dark with a single light bulb overhead, the cracked school cello groaning under his fingers as if it didn't want to be played. Yet, he persisted. Every night, he returned home exhausted, the strain of holding back his frustration heavier than any physical weight. He started waking up in the middle of the night, fingers twitching, mind replaying the upcoming performance like a looping nightmare. His grandmother worried at his questions. "Just stage fright," he'd say. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He felt something closing in on him. Not just the humiliation that had been planned, but something deeper, something institutional. He was being positioned piece by piece into a narrative he hadn't written. He was meant to be the punchline of a private joke, the cautionary tale of why boys like him didn't belong in places like Riverside. It wasn't just about music. It never had been. 3 days before the showcase, he made a decision. He would not play the school cello. He would not stumble through a performance designed to break him. Instead, he would play his own music on his own instrument. He would play it not for them, but for his mother, for his grandmother, and for himself. He stayed up late into the night, writing a new piece in his head. No sheet music, no formal structure, just feeling. It would start softly, like the way his mother used to sing to him when he was a baby. Then it would build layer by layer until it became something too large to ignore. It would tell his story without words, and they would have no choice but to listen. The night before the performance, he polished his cello until it shone. He tightened the strings, tuned them by ear, and tested every note until it rang true. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor and played the entire piece from start to finish. Once, twice, 3 times, until the trembling in his fingers disappeared. His grandmother watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. She said nothing until he finished. "Are you ready?" she asked. Joseph looked up, and for the first time in days, he nodded with certainty. "Yes, ma'am." He wasn't ready because he wanted to be. He was ready because he had to be, because dignity had a sound, and he would make sure they heard it. The morning of the showcase arrived, wrapped in silence. The city outside was still holding its breath. The sky was pale with a hint of cloud that promised neither rain nor light. In the dim light of the apartment kitchen, Joseph sat at the table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. His grandmother had risen earlier than usual, bustling about with the quiet nervousness of someone who wanted to be useful but didn't know how. She had ironed his shirt twice, brushed imaginary lint from his pants, and placed his cello by the door like a soldier's weapon before battle. Joseph hadn't slept much. He had stayed awake listening to the city stir distant horns, someone shouting on the corner, the crash of trash cans in the alley. But his mind was elsewhere. In the quiet moments before dawn, he had played the melody in his head over and over, as if through sheer repetition he could drive out the doubt. Now, sitting in his clean clothes, the polished wood of his cello case reflecting the soft kitchen light, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Not peace exactly, but a resolve that had hardened in the fire of sleepless nights and whispered taunts. The ride to Riverside Academy felt longer than usual. The bus seats were stiff beneath him. The other students were unusually quiet, as if they too were bracing for something. Most of them were excited. Their performances had been rehearsed under the watchful eyes of private tutors and encouraging parents. They wore designer shoes, carried instruments in pristine leather cases, and discussed the conservatory recruiters who might be in the audience. Joseph sat alone at the back, clutching his cello case with both hands, its weight pressing into his knees like a reminder of everything he carried. When they arrived, the school had already been transformed. White and gold banners hung from the stone arches, and satin garlands lined the walkway leading to the auditorium. Inside, the air hummed with a low murmur of excitement and the scent of freshly polished wood. The stage lights had been tested, microphones arranged, and rows upon rows of chairs waited to be filled by parents in expensive coats and school board members with crossed arms. Backstage, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Students adjusted ties and tuned instruments, their low voices mingling. Joseph stood near the edge of the curtain, staring at the polished grand piano in the center of the stage. It shone like a hotel, every inch of it flawless and foreign. His cello looked small beside it, humble. He caught his reflection in its lacquered side, nervous, too thin, too out of place, and quickly looked away. Miss Grace, a young teacher from the English department who had always treated him with kindness, approached him with a gentle smile. She placed a hand softly on his shoulder. "You're going to do great," she whispered. Her voice was warm, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Joseph nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Then Mr. Shelby appeared, clipboard in hand, his voice ringing over the din like a hammer blow. "Places everyone. We begin in 5 minutes." He turned to the curtain and stepped through it onto the stage. The murmur of the audience went silent. Joseph could see him from the wings, standing under the spotlights in his impeccable vest and silver tie, his smile wide but forced. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shelby began, Welcome to Riverside Academy's annual Autumn Showcase. Tonight, you will witness the extraordinary talents of our student body artists, musicians and performers whose dedication and excellence represent the best of what we cultivate here at Riverside. There was some polite, restrained applause. To begin our program, Shelby continued, his tone shifting very slightly. We have something unconventional. A new student, recently admitted through our scholarship initiative, will honor us with his interpretation of classical music. Light laughter rippled through the audience. Just a few chuckles, but enough to make Joseph's stomach knot. Shelby paused theatrically, then said, "Please welcome Joseph Thompson." The applause that followed was uneven. Some parents clapped politely. Others looked confused. A woman in the front row barely lifted her hands from her lap. Joseph walked slowly onto the stage, the weight of his cello balanced against his side, the solace of his shoes making the softest sound against the wooden floor. The lights blinded him. For a moment, he saw only vague silhouettes, rows of suited figures, the glint of gold jewelry, the reflection of camera phones held up not to honor, but to document a failure. He sat down. The chair creaked under him, but he didn't flinch. He placed the cello between his knees, adjusted the end pin, and positioned his fingers. His hands were shaking. He closed his eyes, then remembered his mother's voice, not in song, but in a warning spoken long ago, when they try to make you feel small. Son, play like you're the biggest thing in the room. He took a breath, then another. The first note was barely audible, a whisper of sound like the first words of a prayer. The audience leaned in, unsure if he had even begun. Then came the second note, stretched long and steady. A silence fell over the auditorium. The melody emerged slowly, building from the bottom like something crawling to the surface after years of silence. It wasn't a piece anyone had heard before. It had no name. It wasn't written in any book, but it had shape, sadness, and purpose. It spoke of late nights in forgotten buildings, of a grief too deep for tears, of a hope that refused to die. As the note swelled, Joseph's posture changed. He no longer looked like a frightened boy. He moved with conviction, eyes closed, body swaying with the music. His fingers danced along the strings, with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone without formal training. The cello sang not prettily, but truthfully. Every phrase was deliberate, every pause heavy with meaning. The hall held its breath. Even the skeptics began to shift in their seats. Phones were lowered. Whispers ceased. Some members of the audience leaned forward, brows furrowed, lips parted. They were listening not to a scholarship student or a curiosity, but to a musician. Behind the curtain, several students and teachers had gathered to watch. Miss Grace pressed her hands to her chest. The principal, sitting in the front row next to Shelby, turned her head slightly, suddenly uncertain of the narrative they had prepared. Joseph's piece moved through several phases: grief, defiance, longing, and finally, peace. When the last note faded into silence, it didn't disappear quickly. It hung in the air, a ghost echo that refused to leave. No one clapped immediately. The audience remained frozen, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Then, from the far left of the front row, a woman stood up. She was in her 60s, her silver hair pulled into a bun, and she began to clap slowly, deliberately, one clap after another. Then another person joined her. Then two more. And then, as if something had snapped, the entire auditorium rose in unison. The applause thundered. Some people whistled, others cheered. A few had tears in their eyes. Joseph remained seated, breath short, hands still trembling. He looked at the crowd and found her, his grandmother, sitting in the far right corner, back straight, eyes shining, hands clasped over her heart. She didn't clap. She simply smiled, proud and whole. When Joseph stood, the ovation intensified. He bowed once, simply, and left the stage without a word. The cello case waiting in the wings felt lighter now, though nothing about that day had been easy. Backstage, a few students stepped aside to let him pass. No one mocked him. Some looked away, ashamed. Others nodded faintly, eyes wide. He found a quiet corner and sat down, placing the cello beside him. His heart was still racing, but the fear had burned away. In its place was something steadier. Not triumph, not relief, it was dignity. He hadn't played for their approval, not for their validation, but for his mother, for himself, for every note he had ever pulled from wood and string in the dark. And this time, they had listened. The weekend after the showcase passed like a strange, silent tide through Riverside Academy. The campus itself remained unchanged, well-maintained, the hallways shining, the red brick glowing under the crisp autumn sun. But something beneath its polished surface had shifted. A current vibrated invisibly through the marble floors and vaulted corridors, charging every step, every whisper with something unspoken but undeniably real. Joseph noticed the difference immediately. Monday morning as he walked through the main doors, there were no jeers, no snide looks from passing students. A few looked at him, really looked at him, then turned away almost guiltily. Others offered the briefest of nods, awkward and uncharacteristic, as if they didn't know how to greet someone they had once despised. But it wasn't until he entered the cafeteria that he understood the full extent of what had happened. Conversations died down as he passed. A few students nudged their neighbors and discreetly tilted their phones toward him. Some watched him openly, not with cruelty but with curiosity. And above all, there was a new kind of silence, the kind that comes not from rejection, but from awe. He could feel it creeping along the edges of the room like light before a storm. He found his usual table by the windows and sat alone, his lunch untouched. Within minutes, Miss Grace appeared, her expression unreadable, and slid into the seat across from him. She placed her tablet on the table and turned it toward him. The video played without sound. It was shaky, filmed from the third row of the auditorium. The angle only caught part of his performance, the bow moving across the strings, the glow of the stage lights on his face, the curve of his hunched back. But it was enough. Enough to feel the weight of the silence that had held the room. Enough to hear the pain in every note. Enough to see what the audience had seen, that something extraordinary had happened on that stage. Under the video, there was a view counter. 800,000. Joseph's eyes widened. His breath hitched. It started spreading that night, Miss Grace said softly. Someone posted it to their story and it just caught fire. A few Instagram pages picked it up, then a music blog, then the school board account. It's everywhere now. Joseph blinked at the screen, trying to absorb what this meant. He didn't have social media. He didn't know what going viral felt like, but he knew it was more than just attention. It was a spotlight too bright to hide from. Miss Grace reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. This arrived for you this morning. I thought you should open it before anyone else sees it. He took it with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letterhead read, Manhattan Conservatory for Gifted Musicians. The words were short and formal, but the meaning pierced through every line. They wanted to meet him. They wanted to hear more. He looked up. Why me? Miss Grace smiled, but her voice was serious. Because you made them feel something they didn't expect to feel, and because they recognize greatness when they see it. The next few days passed in a surreal blur. Teachers who had never noticed him before suddenly found reasons to talk to him, commenting on his discipline, praising his raw talent, asking if he had considered applying to elite music schools. Other students hovered nearby, waiting for him to look up and notice them. Some asked questions, others offered shallow compliments, others just stared. But not everyone was happy. Mr. Shelby remained strangely absent. He hadn't attended class since the showcase. Rumors circulated that he had taken a short leave to recover from stress, but no one knew for sure. When he finally returned, his demeanor had changed. He was quieter now, his sarcasm blunted, his comments dry. He made no mention of the performance, no acknowledgement of the viral video, but his sharp, calculating eyes watched Joseph with a new kind of intensity. It wasn't admiration. It was something colder. Joseph felt it, even as his world began to expand. Invitations started arriving. First one or two, then more. Private music schools inquired about his training. Community organizations asked if he would perform at youth events. A nonprofit for inner-city arts programs offered to sponsor private lessons. But through it all, Joseph remained cautious. He still practiced every evening in the small closet near the gym, the one with the flickering light and the dusty mop in the corner. It was the only space he trusted. The music rooms remained inaccessible, his name mysteriously removed from rehearsal lists, his requests marked as pending. When he asked the secretary, she shrugged. "Must be an error," she said, her eyes returning to her computer. His own cello had begun to show signs of wear again. The wood was drying out with the changing weather, and the strings needed replacing. He spoke quietly to one of the junior staff members in the music department, but nothing came of it. And then came the sabotage. It started small. Practice notes disappeared from his locker one afternoon. A few pages from his sketchbook where he scribbled compositions were torn and stuffed into a restroom trash can. Then a cello string snapped in the middle of practice without warning. He knew it hadn't broken under pressure. He had checked it that morning. Someone had tampered with it. He told no one. Not because he wasn't angry, he was. Not because he wasn't hurt, he was. But because he had learned painfully and early that complaints could be twisted. That victims could be painted as troublemakers. That sometimes the only weapon worth wielding was silence sharpened by consistency. He kept showing up, kept practicing, kept nodding politely to teachers he had once ignored, kept smiling faintly at classmates who now pretended they had always seen him. He told himself the music was enough. At home, his grandmother watched him more closely. She didn't ask many questions, but she cooked more than usual, placing plates in front of him with the silent insistence of someone who had no other armor to offer but care. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would sit by the door while he practiced, hands clasped in her lap, listening. On Thursday night, as he finished playing the last note of a new piece, a quiet, hesitant melody that seemed to ring out even after he lifted the bow, she walked into the room. "You're quieter," she said. "Quieter than usual." Joseph shrugged. "Just tired." She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. Instead, she sat down beside him, her knees creaking softly as she lowered herself to the floor. "When your mama was your age," she said, "she used to come home from music school crying. Not every day, but often enough. Her teacher told her she wasn't made for the stage, that no one wanted to hear songs from a black girl with calluses on her hands." Joseph looked at her, surprised. She rarely spoke of his mother's school years. "You know what she did?" His grandmother continued. "She wrote her own song, played it every day, played it until that teacher sat in the back of the class and cried." Joseph swallowed hard. "I didn't know that." "There's a reason your cello is still here," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It remembers." He didn't answer, but the warmth of her hand stayed with him long after she left the room. The next day, as he walked the halls of Riverside, the whispers returned, but they were different now. Not cruel, not mocking, just uncertain, curious, and behind some of them, resentful. Because now Joseph was a threat, not just a moment, not a novelty, but a presence. And to some that was unacceptable. By the end of the week, a rumor had begun to spread that Joseph's performance had been a fluke, that he only gained attention because the audience felt sorry for him, that someone else had helped him compose the piece, that maybe it wasn't even his music. He heard it in snatches in the stairwells between lockers, whispered over textbooks. He said nothing. Instead, he walked into the maintenance room that night, sat down with his cello and began to play again. Not to prove anything, not to fight shadows, but because, in the end, the only truth he had ever needed to tell lived between the notes. And he would keep playing, even if the world tried to silence every string. It had rained the night before. And by morning, the world outside Riverside Academy was glistening and raw. Wet leaves clung to the pavement. The air tasted of damp earth, and a slight chill carried the smell of wood smoke and frost. Inside the school, the hallways buzzed with a peculiar stillness, not quiet, but anticipation. Something unspoken was building beneath the surface. A tension that hung on shoulders and was transmitted through sidelong glances. Joseph moved through the corridors like a shadow, silent, observant. His cello case slung over his shoulder and his steps light. He was used to the staring now. The muttered comments, and the wary smiles that never reached the eyes. He had learned to ignore the whispers and the rumors, how his performance had been a fluke, how someone else had written the piece, how he didn't belong. It was noise. Static he filtered out the same way he filtered out city traffic outside his bedroom window at night. But there were days when the silence became heavy, when the small cuts of cruelty added up until they throbbed beneath his skin. The small acts of sabotage, the missing sheet music, the broken strings, the locked practice rooms, hadn't stopped. They had only become subtler, more targeted. And behind it all, though he never saw it with his own eyes, he felt Mr. Shelby's hand at work. The teacher had returned to his routines, but not his old arrogance. His tone was dry now, polite in the way a snake is polite before it strikes. Every look he cast toward Joseph seemed measuring, as if calculating an unpaid debt. Then came the announcement. It was made during the Monday morning assembly in the Great Hall. The principal stood on stage, hands folded in front of her, voice soft and practiced. "Riverside's annual Arts Week," she said, "will begin in 2 weeks. A beloved tradition, a cornerstone of the school's commitment to creative excellence. The top students from the music, visual arts, and theater departments would be selected to present their work before guest donors, university recruiters, and representatives from national arts foundations." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, murmurs of excitement, and scattered cheers. For most students, it was the event of the year, a chance to shine, to impress, to rise. For Joseph, it was another kind of test. He didn't expect to be chosen, but he hoped. He hoped because he had earned it not through heritage or privilege, but with everything else he had: time, talent, soul. He had proven himself on that stage, not for recognition, but for truth. Surely, he thought, they couldn't ignore him now. But they did. When the participant lists were posted on the glass board in the main hall the following week, students gathered around like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Joseph arrived late. He waited at the back of the crowd, listening to the chatter, watching names being read aloud with excitement and surprise. He didn't rush. He waited until the group thinned out, until only a few remained. Then he stepped forward. He searched once, then again, then a third time more slowly. His name wasn't there. Not under music, not under original composition, not under any category. It was as if he didn't exist. He stared at the board for a long time, his reflection faint in the glass, the list of names hovering like a ghost over his face. There was no explanation. No asterisk, no note about administrative oversight, just an absence. A cold egg settled in his chest. Not fury, not disbelief, just a kind of weary ache. The kind that comes from having hoped for something better and being punished for it. Behind him, a voice broke the silence. "It's not right, and we're not going to let it happen." He turned. Miss Grace stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes burned with a fierce, quiet heat. "I've spoken to the board," she said. "There's no justification. They know what you did on that stage. They know what you're capable of, but some people still want to make you disappear." Joseph didn't speak. He didn't need to. "Not this time," she said. "We're going to create our own stage." The idea took shape like something whispered in secret. It started with a few teachers, Miss Grace, Mr. Rios from history, and Miss Donnelly from theater, who had watched the sabotage in silence for too long. They started talking in corners, scribbling notes in the margins of lesson plans, moving through the halls with a new sense of purpose. And as it spread, it gathered other students who had always felt invisible. Artists whose work didn't fit into neat academic boxes. Musicians who had been overlooked because they didn't play the right instruments or write the right kind of music. One by one, they began to join. Not loudly, not rebelliously, quietly, seriously, like a breath. They called it the real Riverside. The plan was simple. On the same evening as the official gala performance, an event of rigid formality and selected talent, they would host an alternative concert in the back courtyard, a place long neglected by the school. It would be raw, imperfect, unfiltered. It would be open to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. They began secretly gathering equipment, old stage lights borrowed from the theater department, folding chairs from the dining hall, a microphone that crackled but worked, an upright piano donated to the school years ago and forgotten in a storage room under the gym. They found it under a tarp, dusted it off, and tuned it by hand. Joseph watched it all unfold with a kind of cautious hope. He didn't lead. He didn't often speak, but he played. Every day after school, he returned to the closet where he practiced and poured himself into the new piece he was writing. A composition not of bitterness, but of clarity. It wasn't angry. It wasn't soft either. It was honest. He called it March of the Invisible, and in it lived every missed opportunity, every silent act of resilience, every breath he had taken in defiance of those who expected silence. He didn't tell his grandmother right away. Not until the night before the concert, when he came home and found her mending a loose thread in his shirt sleeve. "Tomorrow is the concert," he said softly. She looked up. "The real one?" He smiled. "The real one." She nodded. That was all. Then she patted the seat beside her, and he sat down, letting the sound of her breathing calm his own. The next day passed in a strange haze. The main building bustled with preparations for the official showcase. Parents arriving in black cars, floral arrangements placed in marble entryways, teachers rushing for last-minute rehearsals. But in the back courtyard, behind the rows of buildings and out of reach of the stage lights, something else was taking shape. The folding chairs were set up. The piano had been rolled into place. The flickering lights held steady. Someone had hung string lights between the trees, and their soft glow transformed the space into something magical. Students arrived in waves, some in full uniform, some in jeans and jackets, all carrying instruments, scripts, paintings. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. And just before sunset, Joseph arrived. He wore the same shirt he had worn on the night of the original showcase, clean but simple. His shoes were scuffed. A cello was strapped to his back. He stepped onto the small wooden platform and looked out at the crowd. It wasn't large. 50 people, maybe more, a few teachers, a few parents, students he had never spoken to. Miss Grace stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, face calm. Mr. Rios adjusted the lights. Miss Donnelly handed out cups of tea. He sat down. The cello creaked beneath him. The wind rustled the leaves, and for a moment the world stood still. Then he began to play. The opening notes of March of the Invisible fell like raindrops, delicate, deliberate, precise. The melody rose and turned, weaving through chords of tension and resolution. It didn't scream. It didn't beg, it told the truth. And as he played, the courtyard changed. People leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. A girl in the second row began to cry. Even the wind seemed to settle. And in the distance behind the high windows of the auditorium, the music seeped through the cracks. Some students paused mid-performance. Some turned their heads in the distant shadows. Mr. Shelby stood rigid, watching from behind a curtain. His face was pale, his fist clenched, because he knew that the true concert wasn't happening on the polished stage with chandeliers and carefully orchestrated applause. It was here, in the back courtyard, on wood that creaked under the stars, and no one could stop it. The courtyard had never known a night like this. It had always been the forgotten part of Riverside Academy, a place used for storage deliveries and emergency fire drills. Its stone slabs were chipped. The grass between them was left to grow wild and uneven. It was where students went to steal a moment of solitude, to cry unseen, to call home from a corner where no one could hear them. No one had ever imagined it could become a stage. But that night, under a sky so clear it seemed to have been washed clean, the courtyard had become something sacred. At exactly 6 o'clock, as the last orange of the sunset slipped behind the roofline, the concert began. Joseph stood at the edge of the platform, He wouldn't call it a stage, and looked at the gathered faces. There was no velvet curtain, no assigned seating, no spotlight. The only lighting came from the string lights hung between the skeletal branches of the bare trees and the faint flicker of battery-operated lanterns placed at the base of each chair. There was no announcer, no program, no fanfare. There was only music waiting to be played. He hadn't spoken since arriving. He had greeted no one. Not because he was afraid or wanted to be mysterious, but because there was nothing left to say. Everything he needed to express lived in the melody that had been bubbling in his chest for weeks, begging to be released. All he had to do now was let it out. He adjusted the cello against his knees, tightened the bow with steady fingers, and closed his eyes. The opening notes were barely audible, delicate as a breath. The courtyard leaned in. Even the night air grew still as the first measures of March of the Invisible took shape, slowly blooming into sound. He had composed it with no structure in mind, only emotion. It had no lyrics, but it spoke volumes. In every stroke of the bow, there were years of silence. In every shift of tone, every swell and every dip, there were hallways walked alone, names whispered behind hands, doors that had closed before he even reached them. The music climbed like a story, not loud, but relentless. It gathered momentum as it rose, layering rhythms that mimicked the steady beat of a heart that refuses to stop even when it is tired. His fingers moved with precision, not like a performer pleasing a crowd, but like someone delivering a message that could not wait a moment longer. And the people listened. In the front row, Miss Grace sat motionless, her face unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Mr. Rios stared straight ahead, his eyes glassy. Students who had never spoken to Joseph before leaned forward in their seats, entranced. Parents who had come simply to humiliate their children found themselves gripping the edges of their chairs. The piece wasn't perfect. One note rang flat near the middle. His wrist trembled once as he reached the final section. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. The music didn't beg for pity. It didn't scream in protest. It simply existed. And in doing so, it broke something. When the last note hung in the air, there was no immediate applause. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was complete, respectful. It was the kind of silence that came after something sacred. Then, from the furthest corner of the courtyard, someone clapped. Once, then again, then another joined, and another. And suddenly, the small makeshift concert exploded into sound not of music, but of joy. Real wild applause swept through the crowd like a storm breaking over a parched field. Joseph remained seated, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply looked at them all, the lantern glow reflecting in his eyes, and finally allowed himself a breath. He had done it, but the night was far from over. As the concert continued, one after another, students stepped onto the stage, poets with voices trembling and defiant, dancers who performed barefoot, painters who held their canvases aloft and shook hands. It was a cascade of voices long silenced, now rushing out all at once. The courtyard became more than a performance venue. It became a reckoning. And beyond the auditorium walls, the official gala continued. There, under the chandeliers and orchestral suites, the flawless performances unfolded exactly as planned. Every note on time, every costume pristine. But something was wrong. The audience felt it. There were students missing, a restlessness among the younger performers, a tension in the air. Then someone opened the side doors. At first, it was just a trickle, a parent who had heard rumors about the real concert, a student who had slipped out between acts. Then more came, drawn not by rebellion, but by something magnetic. The sounds of music that was imperfect and alive, of voices that were unfiltered, of something real. Soon, the back rows of the auditorium emptied. Even the teachers began to slip away, muttering excuses about the fresh air. No one tried to stop them. No one had to. They weren't abandoning the gala. They were running toward the truth. Among those who remained was Mr. Shelby. He stood in the wings, arms crossed, jaw tight. His eyes were fixed on the illuminated courtyard in the distance. From his vantage point, he could see the tops of the crowd's heads, the sway of shadows dancing under the trees, the blur of a ghost cello bow in the air. He had spent years building a system where only the right kind of excellence was rewarded, controlled, cultivated, correct. What he saw now was chaos, unruly, unedited, uncontrollable, and it terrified him. He made no move to follow. He stood as still as a stone while the hall emptied. By the time the final act of the official concert took the stage, less than a third of the seats were occupied. In the courtyard, there was no more standing room. When the last performer bowed and stepped back into the crowd, Miss Grace stepped onto the platform. She didn't say anything at first. Then, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the wind, she thanked everyone for coming, not just to the concert, but to something more important, to each other. "We are not here because someone invited us," she said. "We are here because we deserve to be heard." The crowd erupted again. Joseph stood at the edge of the gathering, cello case once again strapped to his back, his fingers still aching from the performance. He spoke little to anyone. A few students approached him, some to congratulate him, others simply to stand by his side in silent solidarity. He received them all with calm. Gratitude, yes, but no need for celebration. For it had never been about winning. As the courtyard began to empty, he found himself walking beside Miss Grace, who was carrying a stack of folding chairs in her arms and humming softly. "They'll be talking about tonight," she said. Joseph looked at her. "Do you think it will change anything?" She paused, then offered a small, tired smile. "Change doesn't always come in a storm. Sometimes it's a note held just long enough for someone to realize it means something." They walked in silence after that. Across the campus, the official concert was over. The principal stood at the podium, thanking donors and shaking hands, her smile tight. The auditorium was half empty. The press had left early. And in the shadows behind the theater, Mr. Shelby stood alone, watching Joseph disappear into the darkness. He had tried to control the story. He had tried to erase Joseph from it. But now the story belonged to someone else. And no matter how hard the school tried to sing its rehearsed songs, the world would always remember the night it went silent. The following Monday after the concert felt like no other morning in Riverside Academy's recent memory. The air was still crisp with the late autumn cool, but other things were floating through the halls, an unspoken awareness that a threshold had been crossed. The walls of tradition that had once seemed impenetrable now looked fragile. And everywhere, students walked with a heightened sense of alertness, as if they were aware of living in the pause between a tremor and a collapse. Joseph arrived at school the same way he always did, silent and early, his cello strapped securely to his back. But this time he wasn't invisible. The moment he walked through the doors, gazes followed him. Not with mockery, not with pity, but with a new kind of hesitant respect. It wasn't a fanfare. No one cheered. No one threw their arms open to him, but he saw it now. They moved out of his way, not out of fear, but out of recognition. In classrooms, conversations shifted. In hallways, whispers gave way to questions. Students who had once laughed behind his back now lowered their voices when he passed. Some greeted him with cautious smiles, as if they feared their past behavior still hung in the air. Others simply nodded, as if acknowledging not just a performance, but a truth they could no longer deny. The administration, on the other hand, said nothing. The principal made no statement, made no mention of the unofficial concert. The school's official newsletter published a glowing summary of the sanctioned showcase, naming the students who had dazzled with their precision and poise. But Joseph's name was absent, as were the names of the dozens of students and teachers who had participated in the courtyard concert, as if it had never happened. But it had happened, and the silence only made it louder. Within days, murmurs reached the school board. Some parents, moved by what they had witnessed in the courtyard, began to call for recognition not just for Joseph, but for all the students who had been excluded. A few wrote letters. Others demanded meetings. Photos began to circulate online showing the courtyard filled with lanterns and students huddled around a rickety stage. One parent posted a video with the caption, "This was the real Riverside." The administration scrambled to respond, but they were too late. A fire had been lit, and it burned with a slow, deliberate certainty. Mr. Shelby, meanwhile, moved through the school like a man drowning in shallow water. He tried to maintain his routines, classes delivered with forced calm, corrections issued in a sharp tone, but the weight of the shifting atmosphere bore down on him. His authority, once unquestioned, now felt hollow. Students no longer laughed at his sarcasm. Some openly challenged his remarks. Others simply ignored him. He tried to regain control of the narrative. He called a private meeting with the principal. He presented documentation, citations from the handbook, performance rubrics, lists of approved instruments and styles. He argued that the courtyard concert had violated school protocol, that those who participated should face disciplinary action. But the principal, wary and besieged, hesitated. The board was already watching. The press had caught wind of the story, and the last thing anyone wanted now was a scandal. Still, a plan was set in motion. That Thursday, an email was sent to several students and teachers, a summons to appear before the school's disciplinary committee. The charges were vague: unauthorized use of school property, disruption of campus events, violation of performance guidelines. Among those named were Joseph, Miss Grace, Mr. Rios, and 8 other students who had played or helped with the courtyard concert. The message was meant to be discreet, but by lunchtime, it was everywhere. The students named in the summons met in the library after school. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't just about rules. It was about control. The concert had embarrassed the administration, and now someone wanted to make an example. That night, Miss Grace wrote a letter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was clear, direct, and unwavering. She outlined the events leading up to the courtyard concert: the exclusion from Arts Week, the sabotage, the systemic dismissal of certain students' talent. She challenged the legitimacy of the disciplinary actions and demanded transparency. Then she shared it with the others, and they all signed it. The next morning, copies of the letter appeared on every classroom door. By noon, parents were forwarding it to school board members. By evening, a digital version had made its way to a national education blog. On Friday, the principal called an emergency assembly. The auditorium was packed, but the air was tense. Students sat with arms crossed. Teachers watched with guarded expressions. When the principal took the stage, she looked paler than usual, her voice less steady. She began with a speech about tradition, about discipline, about upholding the values of Riverside Academy. She spoke of order and decorum, but when she tried to explain the purpose of the disciplinary proceedings, the room shifted. A student in the 3rd row stood up. Then another. Then a teacher. And suddenly, half the room was standing silent, but unyielding. They didn't shout. They didn't chant. They simply stood like trees refusing to bend in the wind. The principal faltered. Her words trailed off. Then from the back of the room, someone walked toward the front. Joseph. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for a microphone. He walked onto the stage and turned to the audience. The cello wasn't with him. He brought no script. He just stood there. "I didn't ask to be invited," he said, his voice steady. "I only wanted to play." The room held its breath. "I didn't ask for attention. I didn't want the boxes. But when I was told I didn't belong, when my name was left off that list, I realized something. I realized that the people who were writing those lists didn't know me and they didn't care." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "So I played anyway," he continued. "And not just for me. For everyone who has ever felt invisible. For everyone who has ever been told they were the wrong kind of talent, the wrong kind of student, the wrong kind of person." He paused, then added, "You don't have the right to erase that." Silence again, not awkward. Not uncertain - powerful. The board responded within days. An independent investigation was launched. Students and teachers were interviewed. Evidence was reviewed. Emails surfaced correspondence between Shelby and administrative staff suggesting intentional exclusion, accounts of tampered instruments, lost sheet music, and locked rehearsal rooms. And then came the decision. Mr. Shelby was dismissed. The principal was placed on administrative leave pending further review, and the courtyard concert was officially recognized as a legitimate school event. New policies were implemented. The selection process for showcases was restructured. The arts curriculum was expanded to include non-traditional forms of expression. A fund was established to support students from underrepresented backgrounds. And Joseph was invited officially this time to perform at the City Youth Arts Gala. He declined. Instead, he suggested a group performance, a medley composed by several students featuring musicians from the courtyard concert, to be played on the school's front lawn, open to the public. It was accepted. On the evening of the performance, Joseph stood under the school flagpole, cello in hand, and played alongside classmates who had once been strangers and teachers who had once felt powerless. The lawn was packed with parents, community members, and alumni. Cameras were rolling, but Joseph didn't care. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for his mother, who once told him his music would speak when his voice couldn't. For his grandmother, who sat in the front row with tears in her eyes and a blanket over her knees. For every note played in the dark, every rehearsal held in closets and borrowed spaces. He played because now the sound could no longer be silenced, and Riverside Academy listened. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to learn more. Watch our upcoming videos for even more powerful stories.